Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra, and welcome back to another episode of The Ivory Tower, the podcast led by the interview platform Room for Discussion, where we aim to make academic insights more accessible and explore key phenomena shaping our world. Across Europe and the United States, right-wing populist movements are inseparable from our political reality, and identity politics are increasingly governing political discourse. While the rise of Western populism has received significant scholarly attention, few have examined its relationship with religion and how right-wing parties use it as a cultural identity marker to advance their agendas. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tobias Cremer and discuss this very issue. In his book, The Godless Crusade, he explores the rise of religious themes and populism in increasingly secular Western societies and the role new social cleavages play in that. Dr. Cremer is a German politician and member of the European Parliament. Prior to his work in Brussels, he obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and served in the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Cremer. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Glad to be here.
So, I would like to start off this interview by exploring your personal story behind the book. You obtained your bachelor's in PPE and hold two masters, one in political science and international relations, and the other one in public policy. Where did the motivation to explore this particular issue come from?
Well, I guess I should distinguish between the roots and the triggers
Ah,
that made me really go into that. In some way, maybe perhaps start with the trigger. And the trigger was that I was studying in the US at the time from 2015 to 17. So you know what happened in 2016,
of
17
course.
was exactly the Trump of the rise, or the rise of the Trump movement. I had lived in the UK just before during the Brexit campaign, and we just saw all over this rise of the far right. And what I found just really interesting was that on the one hand you had this narrative of Trump is coming. It's basically a reactionary thing. It's the past coming back, and you had Handmaid's Tale and all of these things coming out, and it was like, oh, this is just the Christian right all over again. We are back in the 1980s. And I actually found it very interesting. This is a bit where the root causes come in, so to speak. So I'll be entirely transparent. I'm the son of a Lutheran minister in Germany. So my mother, and she was in the peace movement, and it's like quite engaged. But I come out of a family where that played a big role, and I had just always observed that at least in countries like Germany. It was really especially with the migration crisis, was actually the churches that ended up being some of the most critical voices uh, against the far right. And that actually also on a personal level, even in the US, I met even a lot of conservative friends who would go to church, etc. But these were actually the people who were most critical of Trump, even within the Republican Party. So I just felt like, okay, I want to understand, is this really true, this narrative that we have? That this is like Handmaid's Tale all over again? Or is there something different happening? And why do we see, for instance, in the US, in some ways, a lot of references to religion, whereas in Europe, you actually somewhat sometimes said the contrary, where, for instance, in France, Marine Le Pen would say, we are the real defenders of secularism and the separation of church and state. And I guess I just found that really interesting. So I watched that in the US. And then I started my PhD in the UK. It was actually interesting. I initially meant to do a more historical topic, but then I was really getting into that, and my supervisor ultimately told me, "Well, the other topic was German geopolitics of Islam prior to World War One."
Oh,
So very
okay.
historical. And he said, like, the other topic is interesting too, but I think the populism one is where you can have a real contribution. So I did that, and I never regretted it. It was absolutely fascinating research.
Wow, that sounds great. It was a very interesting read, I can say that. So, going a bit more into what you're doing right now, would you say that your PhD was one of the main reasons why you decided to pursue a career in politics afterwards?
I think it's part of it. I mean, I was a cool teenager, so I was involved in politics even from a younger age. And I also say in Germany, for instance, there's that often comes also with the background, like the church background. I was often like the people who were involved there also tended to be involved in politics on the center left in Germany, for instance. Um, but I think yes, in some ways, like trying to really understand what is happening to our societies, trying to understand where this polarization is coming from, where really why we evolve so much into bubbles, why we have so much anger in on both sides of the divide, trying to really understand not what are the immediate triggers of that anger, but what is actually why is this happening across our societies, not just in one society, but across countries, across cultures. I think for me was always a really big part of it. And after the PhD, I was teaching a little bit. But actually, for me, the real point where I said I want to go back into politics was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was one where, because we had students who were of Ukrainian origin and who went back, and I really felt like, okay, this is a moment where our democracy and our societies are threatened from within with populism, but also from without, from Russia. And this is where I first decided to go into the Foreign Office. But even the Foreign Office, I very quickly realized we can't separate these two threats. And I really thought like, okay, we talked a lot about the defense, and we just had the NATO summit in The Hague. But I always, from the beginning, said this isn't just about tanks and drones. It's really about what holds our society together, social cohesion. And if you want to talk about Bob Putnam, it's social capital. It's like what actually makes democracies work, what keeps them together, and how can we, in the root cause, do something against this rise of far-right politics and polarization, and also understand what is the driver of that. It's not just that these are super smart politicians. In some ways, I'd actually claim the contrary. It's not because of their clever strategies, but in spite of their sometimes not so clever strategies, that something is happening in our societies. And I wanted to understand that. And now I'm trying to also do something about it.
All right. Well, I'd like to, you just mentioned root causes. So I'd like to get
Yeah.
started in getting into actually your PhD or your book. So you outlined that right-wing parties in France and in Germany use Christianity as a culturalized symbol of the nation against the external other. I wanted to first know, how did this transformation of religion come about, and why is it so politically powerful?
So it's really fascinating because in a way it's not the obvious thing. Because if you just look at their rhetoric, you might be very much tempted to think like, okay, clearly this must be a backlash against secularization, modernization, and diversity, etc., and reactionary Christians and the far right basically linked together. But then if you look at it a bit more closely, you actually see that in some ways it's almost the contrary, that we see a correlation between increasing secularization and the rise of the far right, but not in the way that the religious people then go for the far right, but actually that it's among the most supportive parts of the population for the far right, these are often the people who are most secularized. So it's the white working class that has been secularizing the fastest recently, and that also is the strongest support group. And in a way, one of the findings that I had is really it's a process of um, in some ways modernization, but also the erosion of traditional group identities. So, I mean, you already mentioned the cleavage theory, but it's basically historically we've always said that our societies is shaped by group identities, and that historically we had two main cleavages as a result. On the one hand, religious or like a cultural one between more secular and more conservative religious side, and then on the other one, an economic one between working class and capitalist, if you like to think of it in that way. So the culture wars and the and the class struggle, if you want to take these terms. And this is based on the one hand of religious group identity, and then on the other hand on economic group identity, like class identity. But what we are seeing is that these traditional group identities are rapidly eroding. So we see secularization, we see the erosion of class identity. We actually see that in many other areas as well, that these group identities, regional, etc., they're disappearing, they're eroding. And as a result, in some parts of the population, you have somewhat of a, let's say, called a crisis of identity to say, like, who actually are we? As a society, as a group, what keeps us together, and who is part of the us, and who is not. And in a way, as a result, you have a new conflict between, on the one hand, let's say a more globalist approach that says, oh, it's all universalist and it's actually only individual society, individual identities that matter, and all these traditional group identities don't matter. And if anything, then it's group identities for minorities that are socially acceptable, but otherwise, no. But then on the other hand, you have a lot of people who say, actually, hold on. Um, Group identities do matter. I want to be part of something bigger. And especially if you are not, let's say, a globalist identity of like traveling the world and you are upper middle class and you go to all the great universities and whatever, you might actually say, no, no, for me, my local identity is actually quite important. And that is eroding. And in some ways, what the far right is doing is they see this, some would call crisis of identity in many of our societies, and they respond to it. But they don't respond to it with a positive identity. But on the contrary, they're just saying, well, we might not know who we are, but we know who we are not. So one of the fascinating findings that I always had was when I asked far right leaders, like, what do you mean when you talk about Christian identity? That wouldn't, like, if I asked this question to social democrats or conservatives or Greens or liberals, I also asked all of them, and they would start talking about theology. I would start talking about the Trinity or the Second Coming, etc. But when I asked the far right about it, almost all of them didn't start with anything positive, but they said, "Oh, we are Christian because we have Sundays off and not Fridays. We are Christian because we have a church in the village, not a mosque. We don't go to that church, but it matters." And they started talking about geography, about culture, about history, but not about faith in any shape or form. And they all started with Islam. So in some ways, it's the us and the other, and they start with the other, and the other is Muslims, migrants, Islam, and it's only given this negative definition of the other that then Christianity comes in as a alternative identity of the us. But this is not really about religion as a faith, but it's much more as what distinguishes us from the other.
And would you argue that is why this rhetoric is still so effective? Because we have more secularizing societies in Germany and in France, but because we're making religion not about the belief anymore, is that why it becomes then so effective?
It definitely becomes more malleable. I mean, if you think about it, that's actually quite interesting. It's nothing new that far right leaders do that. I mean, if you go back intellectually, I mean, it starts with the Action Française in France in the late 19th century, and they would be saying, oh, it's actually we don't want the whole Catholic like love thy neighbor, etc. But Catholic identity that matters to us. But back then, you had a very strong reaction by the Catholic Church, and they actually put a lot of this writing on the index. They actually banned it and excommunicated members of that movement. And it was very clear it was a challenge to the authority of who defines what religion actually is, who speaks for Christianity, Catholicism, whatever. And in some ways, it's perhaps due to secularization that this monopoly given to the churches of saying we define what Christianity is, because so many the churches have become so much weaker, so many fewer people have this relationship with church leaders, that in some ways this identity becomes a little bit up for grabs. And this is where the far right then comes in and says like, okay, we are going to redefine Christian identity from our perspective, and then it's not about loving thy neighbor or Christ risen or turn the other cheek, but it's actually no, no. This is like our cultural identity. It's European white history. It's crusades and all of these things, and it's quite interesting also the reaction of the churches towards that, because it's in a way a struggle about what we also as societies um, consider to be Christian.
So we just talked about, we touched upon many things like the culturalization
Yeah.
of the Christianity, identity, cleavages, and you create this model, the triangular national populist worldview in your book. Just so how exactly in that does now religion and identity cleavages fit in so that we can paint our like foundation to then move into the case studies?
Yes, absolutely. So I basically use this because I'm talking about populism and about identity politics. And basically there is more and more of an emerging consensus. Like in some ways, populism, we shouldn't just think of it as bad. or like it shouldn't be a the word political Kampfbegriff, so it shouldn't just be used for the political opponent, but actually trying to look at it from a social science perspective. What brings populists together in all sorts shapes or forms? They're very different contexts, but they tend to have one ideological core that binds them together, and that is that they create a almost Manichaean tension, or like an us versus them distinction between, on the one hand, the good, the homogeneous people, it's the us, is the good guys, and then on the other hand, you have the elite. And the elite is the corrupted liberal elite, and that actually binds together left-wing populists and right-wing populists as well. So it's this Manichaean distinction between the good people and the bad elite. But what brings then right-wing populism in, and what distinguishes that from, say, left-wing populism, is that it also creates a second other. So you have the internal other, that's the liberal elite, and then you have the external other that is undermining national identity, the purity of the people from without. And that external other is in Europe primarily defined as migrants, and especially as Muslim migrants. And this is really where religion enters the whole story in the first place. And it's very interesting because what that you have this negative definition of the other that threatens the purity of the people, and then you actually can see parallels of they find different contrasts to that other. So on the one hand, what I write about is really this use of, okay, if they are Muslim, then we must be Christian. It's a bit what I told you earlier about like the not the mosque in the village, but the church. But it's actually really interesting in parts of Europe. Like if you look at the Netherlands, or if you look at the Rassemblement National in France, they don't actually take the Christian part. They're saying, oh, if they're Muslim, then we must be secular. And you even had in some moments, I mean, it's changing a little bit now, but initially both the Rassemblement National and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, for instance, said like, okay, they're Muslim, that means they're conservative. So we are the real defenders of women rights, and we are the real defenders of gay rights, and we are the real defenders of Jewish minorities against this other. So it's really you can, and if you talk to far right movements, they actually say like, oh, we can be flexible on what we are in this respect, but what unites us is that we are against the liberal elites, and then against Islam. But if you look to the US, for instance, then yes, then they really go and say like, okay, if they are Islam, they are other, then we must be white Christians.
Okay, so from what I gather, the relation between the state and religion in itself is always a bit different. Or between the right-wing parties. Sorry, my microphone. So I would now like to move to the three case studies that you discuss in the
Yes.
book, which are Germany, France, and the US. So talking first about Germany, I think, or what I gathered, the most important part to understand how everything there is built is the concept of benevolent neutrality when it comes to the relationship of the church and the state. Would you mind outlining that?
Yeah, it's a classically complicated German system, but it's basically benevolent neutrality means that on the one hand, the state is neutral. There's no state religion, like there is, for instance, theoretically in the UK, but that the state still recognizes that religion in some ways is something good, and that's in some ways a lesson from World War II, where you had and the Nazi regime, because there you had a totalitarian regime that was basically saying we are the state and we are totalitarian. It's just between the individual and the state. And that is how the you can have total control. And the fathers and mothers of the German Constitution were saying, actually, what matters is also the in between, the pre-political, what keeps society and communities together. That is not controlled by the state, not by the political, but by the pre-political. And this is why in Germany we have, you mentioned benevolent neutrality, but it's actually we also have unions, labor unions have a special status in Germany, and a lot of other groups, because this is seen as something very positive. That and to for the lawyers out there, in Germany we call it the Bockenförde conundrum. That basically says the secular liberal state relies on preconditions that it cannot itself provide. What does that mean? It means that to be secular and liberal, the state cannot impose its view on religion, or its ideology, but it just provides a framework. But that framework needs to be filled. And this is where you then see roles for civil society, including religion. So this is why in Germany churches are, in some ways, all churches and mosques and synagogues, in theory, have the right to become state supported, so that they are incorporated and they can advise in decisions in parliament, but also on state level, etc. Because they're saying, okay, this is part of the society, and some of the effects are, on the one hand, that you actually don't have a very aggressive, you don't have a lot of polarization around religion in Germany, because in some ways there's a moderating factor on politics because religious voices are heard institutionally, but it also has an impact on religious voices because they are part of the system. And that actually means in in turn, that this is also part of the reason why far-right populists don't like them. Because in a way, a German bishop, it doesn't get more system. It doesn't get more part of the establishment. And this is why you also have a very strong reaction against them and vice versa. It would be very tricky for a German bishop to say, "Oh, I'm part of the revolt against the establishment from their pulpit of a semi-established or like at least a constitutionally protected church."
All right. We'll move a bit into the religious supply side in Germany in a
Yes.
second, but you already touched upon it a bit about identity and cleavages and how new ones are emerging. And you argue that the traditional center parties in Germany, so the SPD and the CDU, moved closer. Also, the CDU under Angela Merkel moved closer to the cosmopolitan side of that of the new identity cleavages, and the AfD tried to step into this resulting identity or representation gap. But then, interestingly, as you touched upon very shortly, you highlight that many voters who actually felt abandoned, maybe by the CDU, the very religious one, didn't move to the AfD, but moved to more left-wing parties, which is maybe against what one would intrinsically or naturally think. So, how do these two dynamics then fit together?
Yeah, I mean it's obviously tricky and it moves a lot, but it was quite fascinating that so yes, on the one hand you had most centrist parties, and I mean in some ways this has changed over the last couple of years as well, because a lot of the centrist parties have now moved, for instance, very strongly against immigration. But for especially the 2010s, you had this idea of a cosmopolitan conservatism, Angela Merkel's idea of also saying refugees welcome, etc., etc. And as a result, you had some of these people who felt there was a crisis of their identity, also through changing demographic change, and they felt like, where do we belong? Who gives us a positive idea of what our community means and what it means to have an identity of our own? And this is where the right and populists try to basically come in. What has then been interesting is that some far right, some center right movements and parties try to copy paste some of the solutions of the far right, or some, I wouldn't say solutions, but some of the rhetoric of the far right. Um, but actually more copying their rhetoric rather than looking, okay, what are the root causes? So they didn't look at like, okay, how can we create an open and inclusive source of positive identity? But rather they were saying, okay, they are talking about migration, so we will start talking about negatively about migration. And that is really interesting because when they did that, then the churches, who even the Catholic Church, who in Germany is traditionally not affiliated, but the CDU tends to do quite well among Catholics, um, they came out and said, like, hold on, that is against our teaching, and that doesn't really work well with us. And also this use of Christian symbols in a more identitarian matter to say like, oh, this is German identity, etc. And the churches came out and said like, hold on, we didn't like that when that was happening in the 1930s, and we like it even less now. And you had the It's quite interesting if you look at the people who are very active in Germany's churches. They actually often There has been a trend that a lot of them has been somewhat of a center left drift in recent years, and I think it's partly because a lot of them felt like the especially immigration policy of the conservatives was not going in that direction. Obviously, there are other other cleavages where it might be moving back and forth. So these people often tend still to be quite conservative when it comes to sexual morality, LGBTQ rights, etc. But it is quite interesting that when you polarize on the migration issue, then the churches and many practicing religious people actually tend to be more open towards immigration than irreligious voters.
So, in your book, or when it was published, I remember reading that you said that it's still to be seen how the CDU changes under Friedrich Merz. And we've now had an election cycle, and he's been in leadership for quite some years. And based on current polls, we can see that the AfD is stronger than ever. So
Mm.
you already touched a bit upon this, the issue that maybe this conservative realignment is actually not working as well as the CDU would want it to retain their voters. So, looking at where we are at right now in Germany, what is the role of the CDU and specifically of the religious supply side to counteract potentially the continuous rise of the AfD?
Yeah. Now I have to decide whether I put my political hat on or my my academic hat. But I mean, it is, and this is something that is I actually don't think that controversial. But like we see in most social science studies that if you simply copy paste the rhetoric of the far right, I mean, voters aren't stupid. They just go for the original. But that doesn't mean that we should just ignore the far right and the reasons behind it. Rather, we should try to understand the root causes. And as we said, the root causes is in many societies a sense that social cohesion is eroding, that there's this sense of like what binds us together as a society is eroding. But then instead of going to do what some center-right parties are saying, is like, oh, okay, in that case, we don't like migrants either. You should rather think about what positive alternative can we go. And I mean, and to be fair, you also have to address some of the issues. I think, especially when it comes to migration, we should move out of this very ideological, polarized debate of either open borders and all migrants welcome and that's fantastic, or to say all migrants are terrible and we shouldn't have them, but to say like, okay, how can we concretely make that legally possible? How can we actually make sure that these people can work and integrate properly? We need migration, but it should be controlled, and all of these things. So on the one hand, you have to have really quite boring solutions on the ground that go from building housing and making sure that there's enough public housing to migration courses and teachers and all of these things. So not the polarized bit, but just the boring thing on the ground. But then on the other hand, when it comes to the perhaps more the narrative side of things, then I think it's a real challenge for democratic parties to say, we have to recognize the reality that there is in parts of the population a crisis of cohesion, a crisis of what binds us together, and that we shouldn't just say like, oh, that's their problem, we are happy, whatever, but to actually take that really seriously and see how can we provide an inclusive source of collective identity? How can we actually have something to say this binds us together? And that's something to be proud of, because this is one thing that we can see in a lot of countries where integration has been more successful, is usually not to say okay, multiculti and everybody does what they want, but to say no, here is something that binds us together. If you look at a lot of Scandinavian countries, I was recently in Norway, and they were actually saying yes, we have migrants, but they immediately have to learn the language, they immediately have to start working here, but also to show them you are part of the society, you shape it, you have responsibility. And I know we criticize the US a lot, but if you look at it in the long run, the US is one of the most successful societies in integrating newcomers, because the American source of group identity is not about in Europe, very often history and even nationality, and unfortunately sometimes even ethnicity. But they're actually saying it's we have some shared ideas like freedom, pursuit of liberty, and also say it's hard work being together and building this mix of things. And I think we as Europeans have to move from a ethnically, culturally defined, historically defined source of identity to something perhaps a bit more forward-looking, but no less clear of there can also be a sense of pride. And I actually think in some ways the European idea, the European project can be such a sense of pride, of something inclusive that is inherently diverse, inherently brings together a lot of different cultures, but is still something unique in the world. And no other place in the world do we have this combination of freedom and wealth, but also of solidarity and social cohesion. And there's a reason why a lot of people in the world want to go to Europe. They don't run away to China. They don't run away to other parts of the world. They see something special in Europe, and there's a reason why people in Ukraine are risking their lives because they see this European way of life. And I think that can actually be something we can be proud of, but that is also open for newcomers to be part of that.
It is, I don't know how political I can get.
Yeah, that was your turn.
No, I personally I very much agree, but I think it's now part for me to move on to the French populist, right? Just to quickly investigate that as well, as looking at the time. So in your book, you clearly outlined that a very distinguishing aspect about France is the concept of, excuse my French, laïcité.
Nice to, yeah, très bien.
Laïcité. And how it shapes the relationship between religion and the French state and the French public life. So how does this manifest in the way that the Rassemblement National actually approaches its way of being a right-wing populist party?
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit, you already gave part of the answer. It's because in some ways, a lot of secular Europeans, we tend to think that secularism is the absence of religious identity, or it's the absence of ideology. But if you look at French laïcité, laïcité itself is a national identity. Laïcité itself has sometimes aspects of religion. I forgot who it is, but one of the founders of the Third Republic said, for instance, the French school is the Church of the Republic. L'école, c'est l'Église de la République. And you can really see, you have these ceremonies, you have these temples of laïcité. So laïcité is not an absence, but laïcité is its own thick identity. And in some ways, you always had these two Frances. You had the old Catholic France, and then you had the Republican laïcité France. And so that really became part of a substitute religion. I'm sure some French colleagues will now contradict me, but I do. If you look at it from a sociologist's side, this is really what it does, and what the far right under Marine Le Pen has done is quite interesting, because initially under her father Jean-Marie. Initially, there was a lot of also traditionalist, Catholic, even monarchist, and Marine Le Pen went in and said, like, no, hold on, actually, French identity, not this like weird Catholic historical stuff. French identity is laïcité. So she, in some way, sidelined the more reactionary traditionalist voices and said, like, we are French society. What makes us French is we are against Islam, but the counter side is not Catholicism, it's actually laïcité. And so it was interesting. So, for instance, when you had the demonstrations against gay marriage, where it was a mobilization of French Catholicism, Marine Le Pen didn't go. And she didn't want many of her supporters to go. And that's quite interesting. But what is also interesting in France is that in some ways that has shifted. So you had Éric Zemmour, for instance, or Marion Maréchal, so the niece of Marine Le Pen, and they try to do a little bit more, really using religious references once again to say, like, okay, we want to have both. But even that's interesting. I think Éric Zemmour said it once very clearly. We are for the church, but we are against Christ. So he said very clearly, like, they like the idea of everything, like the nice historical building and the history, and when everybody still looked the same. But on the other hand, they don't like the idea of Christ, the idea of charity, the idea of loving their neighbor. They really didn't like Pope Francis, who was very clear on immigration. And that's a really, really fascinating dynamic, but it really shows you it's not about religion in a way. Religion is the effect, not the cause. The cause is really this idea of a negative source of identity directed against immigration and demographic change.
And you also mentioned the disappearance of the religious supply side in France in that regard
Yeah.
as well. So where in Germany you had the Catholic Church speaking out, in France it actually disappeared from I think it was 2002, where they had the actual um, reaction against the right-wing parties, where it then ended up disappearing. So how do you relate it to this? And is there anything that can realistically fill that void in France?
I mean, it's quite interesting. You're right. Like when you had 2002 Cardinal Lustiger at the time, they were very, very clear. This is when Jean-Marie Le Pen was first time in the second round of an election, and they took a very clear stance. They said this is not an option for Catholics. This is going against everything we teach. And what was interesting to me, so in 2017, when Marine Le Pen came into the second round. It was quite fascinating because there the churches just remained silent. Whereas the Protestant church, they came out against it, Muslim communities came out against it, the Catholic Church remained silent. And I was interested in my research as well to figure out, oh, have they changed? Have they become more right wing? Have they become more open? And what was fascinating was that privately, most church authorities that I talked to were just as critical in 2017 as they were in 2002, but they got the sense also with the crisis of religion itself that they played a less important role. They felt we are not really part of the French establishment anymore, and in some ways they took what some scholars have called the Benedict option. That means that instead of saying we are ingrained in society and we are part of society, we should also be a voice of conscience in society. They said, no, no, we should retreat into our inner walls, disengage from politics, become somewhat apolitical. And that has as a result that they didn't want to take a stance. But I think in the end, that might actually turn out to be not without risks, because it means that the far right could just say like, oh yeah, see, not even the churches or the Catholic Church condemns what we are doing, and you could actually see that in some of the voting behavior, and that is something we haven't touched too much upon now. But in Europe, what you historically have seen, in some ways the contrary to the US, is that the more religious you are, the more practicing you are, the less likely you were to vote for far right parties. And that is not because Christians are better people or whatever. It's actually, when it comes to attitudes, most research suggests that Christians or other religious people can be just as prejudiced as their secular neighbors. But there is something of a social taboo effect that basically means that the people who tend to go to church, we don't know whether it's because they listen to sermons or whether people who are more attuned to social taboos tend to still be in church at the time of secularization. But they listen to what church authorities say, and it plays a role in their behavior. So even if they might share some of the far right attitudes, they feel that this is not socially acceptable in a way to vote in that direction. That explains a lot of why in Germany, for instance, the AfD massively underperforms among Christians compared to irreligious voters. And historically, you had that in France as well. But what changed in France was in some ways since 2017, this effect is actually disappearing. It's still a little bit there among practicing, but it's becoming much, much less. And I think part of that is also that the church is not choosing to use this authority that it still has
So
to do.
you just specifically outlined that this is actually more of a European phenomenon, that religious voters tend to not vote right wing. As we just did with France and with Germany, there's a very core topic when one wants to understand the relationship between the state and religion in the US as well, which is the idea of civil religion.
Mhm.
And so I would like to ask you what exactly this is, how it shaped this identity in the US of, I think, religion and Christians specifically. And there's a third question. You alluded to this already in the beginning, but actually in the 1960s, you said that we had some fundamental changes which caused a conservative aftershock.
Mhm.
And my question now is as well, do you think with Trump and what we're seeing right now, we're experiencing a second conservative aftershock to the whole woke movement?
Yes. Okay, so I'm trying to see where I start because these are three
What is
questions I
civil
could talk to.
religion?
Yeah.
How it shaped the Christian identity in the US?
Yeah.
And then second conservative aftershock.
Yeah. Alrighty. So basically, civil religion. I mean, if you want to get nerdy about that, Phil Horsky is your man. He's a fantastic researcher at Yale, and he writes about it a lot. But it's basically not too dissimilar from the what is described earlier as German benevolent neutrality, and that is basically that the American founding fathers also felt like we want a separation of church and state. the wall of separation, very famous. But it's very different from the French laïcité one. The French laïcité was the idea we protect the state from the church and like religion stay out. In the US, in some ways, because it was a tradition of also religious dissenters, religious minorities, they in some ways wanted to protect religion and religious diversity from the state. But religious diversity was still seen as like that is actually the driving thing, that's the core identity, and then the state should like kind of hold back and let religion flourish, the marketplace of religion. And basically what civil religion then became was the common ground where people could agree on. It's actually interesting because it was very malleable. Because in the beginning you had mainly like white Anglo-Saxon, like WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and civil religion actually tended to be pretty Protestant and Anglo-Saxon. So it was like very clear, like these traditions, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, etc. And even Germans and Polish and the Catholics was a little bit dodgy. But that evolved with, and this is what I think is actually interesting in the American identity, as more migration happened, that actually started to become a bit more open. At some point, it was Christian, so Catholics were allowed into civil religion. And after the end of the Second World War, it was even Jews were allowed, and then it was Judeo-Christian. So you can see this expanding to include to account in some ways for the more diverse American population. And ultimately, I mean, you have some attempts even in the early 2000s to actually say like, ooh, let's say Abrahamic to bring in Islam, to try to use civil religion in a way as something inclusive. I mean, we shouldn't forget civil religion can also be used, or at least there has been some exclusive ways to use it when they were saying, oh, this is what I would distinguish in some ways white Christian nationalism as a strong tradition in the US, where it was really try to use white Christian nationalism to really say like everybody who isn't white and Christian should stay out. But civil religion also has the tradition also had the potential of being inclusive. So one of the uh, biggest protagonists and also biggest defenders of civil religion was Martin Luther King Jr. And the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King Jr. Really used this civil religious rhetoric of saying, America, this is you're the city upon the hill. There's something you have a certain almost religious mission. You should be the beacon of hope for the disenfranchised, and that means especially live up to your own standards when it comes to African American minorities, but also other minorities. And this is what we basically saw evolving. But what is interesting now is that basically Trump didn't pick that up. He's probably, if you look at his speeches, he doesn't talk about civil religion in terms of, oh, these are the shared values that connect all of us, regardless whether we're Christian, Muslim, or Christian. He actually does the exact contrary. He does the white Christian nationalism of saying, I really care about the values and beliefs, but the war on Christmas, that's big. Or just holding up a Bible, even if it's the wrong way around, and standing in front of a church that he's never stepped foot in. That's big. And that's really in some ways the exact opposite of this more inclusive idea of civil religion. He's bringing in some ways it's interesting, a secularized idea of white Christian nationalism, where church and faith is somewhat taken out, and Trump is very openly irreligious. But he says like, "Ooh, but I like the idea of white Christianity." I don't know how many questions I've now answered of the three, so you have to hold me to account.
I would probably turn back to the last one actually. So
Yes.
I understand. It was more
Yeah.
how the Trump reaction can be seen as a second conservative aftershock to the woke
Yeah.
movement.
So I mean, like it's hard to put that into there's no monocause, and I think as I mentioned earlier, there are some bits where far right populist movements across different countries, just by how demographic changes have been happening and this erosion of group identity and rapid ethnic change. In some ways, even if there hadn't been Trump, we probably would have had something of a movement in that direction. But there is a lot of literature out there that actually suggests that by adopting left-wing identity politics on the left, um, that has accelerated or even strengthened the right-wing identity politics on the right. And it's really interesting because they're actually using a lot of the same language. So if historically you had white supremacists and they would really be like hierarchical and there's just like these hierarchy of races, now they actually picked up on the rhetoric of in some ways left-wing identity politics about, ooh, everybody has a right to their cultural heritage and it should be protected. And it's much more a rights-based thing of like, oh, it's just everybody's different, but people should have the right to protect that. The key difference is though, they don't want this right for minorities, but for the ethnic majority. And there's obviously a big tension because if you have it in the majority, then there is the potential of it becoming like oppressive, whereas that risk is relatively limited in the minority. But still, picking up on that. And picking up on some of the grievances where a lot of the people who were suffering in say white working class who are feeling there's this crisis of identity. And if you actually look at it, white working class males, I think, are the only part of the population in the US whose life expectancy has actually been decreasing, who in very often their educational attainments have gone down. A lot of these things, and if you then imagine you are a white working class person, you might not be very wealthy, you might have a lot of deaths of despair in your family, you might have a lot of drug abuse in your family, you're really struggling, and then you have some, I don't know, Harvard graduate who comes tell you that you are a privileged epitome of evil, but still expect you to vote for them. That's not going to go down well. I mean, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but that is some of the sense that some of these populations had, that actually the center-left parties who should be there protectors in a way, because these are economically disadvantaged people, they had the sense that a lot of people in these parties actually looked down on them, had this like, ooh, we are the future and you are the past. And that is, I don't think it's very respectful, but I also think it's not very politically intelligent. But you have to find a way to be inclusive and actually say, we are helping everybody who's disadvantaged, regardless of the color of their skin. And obviously, there is systemic racism. But the good thing is, if you help everybody disadvantaged, you disproportionately help the people who, because of systemic racism, also suffer as minorities.
And then how exactly did Trump manage to tie, or it's Trump, but then how exactly did this religious identity tie into this so extremely, where you then have the idea that somebody says themselves that they believe in God and in Jesus. However, the then, for instance, stance in immigration is super exclusionary.
Yeah. No,
So,
it's, I mean, sorry.
sorry, I just wanted to re-clarify once more. So, how exactly did we then make this link between, so I guess, all this newly emerging identity cleavage in the US, Trump, and this idea of Christian nationalism?
Yeah. It's quite interesting in some ways. What you see in the US is so initially it was quite interesting in the first primaries. We actually saw something similar to Europe, where Republican voters, Trump actually did best in the primaries among those Republican voters who never went to church. Whereas he underperformed among the like weekly churchgoers. Um, but in some ways, because you have this American polarization as well, once he became the candidate, a lot of these voters said, like, okay, we go with the Republican because they perceived the center left as being hostile to religion and to, which is a little bit nuts because Hillary Clinton was very Methodist. But they had this sense, and I think in some ways also because the center left in some ways was almost embarrassed about some of its religious traditions. Which once again I think is a little bit of an elite phenomena as well, because if you think about who's the most religious group in the United States, it's not white evangelicals. It's actually African Americans followed by Latinos. And these are some of the strongest bastions of the Democratic Party. And I think if they really want to go for that coalition, I think they should take it also very seriously. But a lot of the, especially white Christian voters, had the sense that that was not that they were hostile towards them because also of this perceived disdain from that they thought was there from elites. And so they then said, okay, he's the lesser evil. But what is then really interesting is that initially some prominent evangelicals spoke out against Trump, but these voices became quieter and quieter over time. And that's partly because they lost access. It's also partly because a lot of the voters in America then said like, oh, if you say something against Trump, I just change my church. You can't really do that if you're Catholic, say, in Europe, but that happened in the US. And as a result, we saw that in some ways the Christian right, which used to be a driving force in the Republican Party, um, is no longer a driving force, but they almost admitted defeat and are just saying everything that Trump says is fine. But they're not the agenda setter. They're just parts of the coalition, and actually, in a way, part of the coalition that doesn't have much of a say. I went talked to people in the White House, and I'm actually saying, "Oh no, it's the MAGA people, it's Steve Bannon, etc. These like crazy Christians. They don't really have a lot of access anymore." And that's a real shift because, in a way, what we are seeing there is almost a secularization of white evangelicalism, which seems a contradiction itself because evangelicalism was should be about it really being faith driven. But you can actually see it in a lot of the numbers. A lot of people who start calling themselves white evangelicals don't go to church anymore. A lot of the people who call themselves white evangelicals, if they're asked, why have you become a white evangelical? They don't say like, oh, I had a conversion to Christ. It's like, no, no, I like Trump. And I've kind of understood that being conservative and being white means I must be an evangelical. You even have some Jews and Catholics who say like, oh, no, but like clearly I'm white and I'm conservative, so I must be an evangelical, even if I'm actually Jewish. And I think that just shows you that this label has become culturalized and just a source of identity that is not really about faith, but it's much more about what it symbolizes. And in some ways, it symbolizes whiteness in parts of America. And you could actually see it on January 6th, after the last election. You had, on the one hand, you had these crosses and people played Christian music, but you also had this shaman and Viking veneer. And it actually worked together because both Vikings and and Christianity was seen as symbols of whiteness. And that is basically what connects it, but it's not about theology.
This ties actually in very nicely to my last question on this. So it seems a bit looking at the US, what you described, we're kind of entering a vicious cycle, a vicious circle in regards to Trump and especially how the US is structured. There's not really a like clear authoritarian, authoritative, authoritative religious voice.
Freudian
Um,
slip.
Oops. There's not really authoritative religious voice that can actually say something on this idea of like Christianity and kind of keep it from further sliding down into this Trumpian way. So is there anything that we can add on the religious supply side in the US, or can the Democrats even step up to keep this vicious cycle from going on?
I mean, it's hard to. The question is, who are we? Because I think there's a big difference to draw. I mean, if you are a Democrat, I mean, one thing I would say is like leverage some of the voices that you say you are representing, and leverage, for instance, much more of the African American community because they're incredibly progressive, but they also have a very strong religious part of it. The Black church is incredibly powerful in these movements. And for instance, Senator Warnock, I think is a fascinating. He's a preacher in the church where Martin Luther King preached, and he's now one of the senators of Georgia, and he's actually a very powerful progressive voice. And I actually, if I was a Democrat, I would say like let's leverage these voices. And I think they actually in the Democratic Party, a lot of people who do that, who actually say like let's build a broad coalition. Let's try to get out of the culture wars. Let's try to get out of the identity politics and build a broad coalition. And actually, no better speaker than an African American preacher. I don't know if you ever listened to one, but it's incredible. Um, but at the same time, this is obviously it's not the role of the Democrats to do religion or to reshape the American religious landscape. I think they should just represent the pre-political. They shouldn't become the ultimate political. They should represent they should stay out of the pre-political. They can just represent. And when it comes to the pre-political, obviously there things are more difficult because it's beyond the control of political parties. But I still am somewhat optimistic because you actually see incredibly strong communities in the United States that have strong social cohesion. I mean, I mentioned Putnam very early on, and the American social capital is actually very impressive. I remember the first time I moved to the US, the amount of volunteering happening in the United States, multiple time of that what we do in Europe. The civil engagement you still see in the United States much higher than in our European countries, and I think there is a power behind that that still gives me hope. I mean, American democracy has never been quite at ease. There have been a lot of problems in its hundreds of years of history, and from slavery, from civil war, from like you have the 1960s and the 1980s, where it was an incredible pressure, and yet it somehow survived because I do think there is a strong, like a strength behind it. But I think it's also really important in the US to recognize that what makes America strong is not its politicians and it's not the political, but it's the pre-political, it's the communities and civil society that's behind that, and that really needs to be strengthened. It's not self-evident that that's there, but that's the strongest bastion against authoritarianism. This is what I'm counting on now, also as we see Donald Trump clearly disregarding some parts of the Constitution.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Cremer. And on that note, thank you for joining us today. And
My
to all of
pleasure.
our listeners, don't forget to check out roomfordiscussion.com for more upcoming interviews and to see what we're up to over the summer break. This was the Ivory Tower. I'm Alexandra, and don't miss out on our next episode.